In a quiet town, where the days were calm and peaceful, there was a dense forest that everyone loved. The trees towered high above, their leaves whispering softly in the wind. This forest was a favorite spot for families to take walks and children to explore. It wasn't too far from the town, and most people had visited it at least once. But on one sunny afternoon, this forest would witness something no one could have ever imagined. Max was a young boy with an adventurous spirit. He loved playing outside, especially in the woods. His friends often joined him. But that day, they had all gone home early. Max didn't mind. He preferred being alone when exploring. He loved the feeling of discovery, the sense that there was always something new waiting for him behind every tree. He had been walking for a while, his sneakers crunching against the dried leaves, when he suddenly felt something different. The forest seemed quieter than usual. Max paused, listening closely. There was no wind, no birds singing, just silence. It was odd, but Max didn't think much of it. He shrugged and kept walking deeper into the woods. He had been here many times before, but today felt different. A part of him felt excited, like he was about to find something special. Not far from where he was, two figures appeared. Max was still a little way off, hidden behind a thick bush, and he didn't see them at first. But as they came closer, he realized they were two men in police uniforms. Max froze. He had never seen these officers before. He was curious, but also nervous. What were they doing here? It wasn't unusual to see police in the town, but it was strange to see them so deep in the forest, far from the usual paths. Max took a few steps back, trying to stay hidden. His heart beat faster. The officers looked around, making sure no one was nearby. Then one of them reached down and grabbed a large, heavy bag from the ground. It looked odd, like it didn't belong in the woods. Max, still hidden, couldn't help but wonder what was inside. The officers didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They kept their voices low, talking quietly as they walked to a more secluded part of the forest. Max, filled with curiosity, crept forward just enough to follow them without being seen. His small footsteps were light, and the officers didn't seem to hear him. He watched as the two men stopped at a small clearing. One of the officers began to dig into the soft earth, using his hands and a small shovel. The other officer looked around nervously, as though checking if anyone was watching. Max crouched behind a tree, his breath barely audible, trying to see what was happening. After digging for a few minutes, the officer placed the bag in the hole. He looked at the other officer, who gave a nod. Then, without saying another word, they both quickly left the clearing and walked back the way they came. Max stayed still, watching them until they were out of sight. He was now left standing in the middle of the woods, his mind racing with questions. Why had the officers buried a bag? What was inside it? And why were they acting so strangely? Max had never seen anything like this before. He felt a chill run down his spine, but his curiosity pushed him to investigate. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew he had to find out. Max stood still for a moment, watching the spot where the two officers had disappeared. His heart was racing, and his mind was filled with questions. Why had they buried a bag in the woods? Why were they acting so suspicious? Max couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It didn't make sense. The woods were peaceful and quiet, a place where families went for walks, not somewhere where people buried bags. He looked around, making sure no one else was nearby. The forest seemed as calm as ever, but there was a strange weight in the air, like something important had just happened. Max felt a tug of curiosity in his chest. He had to know what was inside that bag. What if it was something important? Maybe it had something to do with the officers, maybe even something they didn't want anyone to know. Max took a deep breath. The thought of uncovering a secret excited him, but he also felt nervous. What if the officers found out he had seen them? What if they came back? He shook his head. No, he couldn't let fear stop him. He had to find out. Slowly, he started walking toward the spot where the officers had buried the bag. His footsteps were soft, and the forest around him seemed to grow quieter with each step. As he approached the clearing, he kept an eye on his surroundings, making sure no one was watching him. He knelt down where the officers had dug the hole and looked at the soft earth. There were still signs of the hole they had left behind, clumps of dirt scattered around, as if someone had hurriedly covered it up. Max's hands trembled slightly as he reached down to start digging. He wasn't sure what he would find, but his curiosity was too strong to ignore. Max used his hands first, feeling around in the dirt, but it was hard to get any grip. He then found a small stick lying on the ground and used it to scrape away the soil. It wasn't long before he felt something hard beneath his fingers. His heart raced again as he realized he had found the bag. It was buried just a few inches under the surface, as if the officers had wanted to hide it quickly but not too deep. With careful movements, Max pulled the bag free from the dirt. It was large, and the material felt tough and heavy in his hands. Max stared at it for a moment, wondering what could be inside. His fingers itched to open it, but he hesitated. What if it was something dangerous? What if the officers had buried something that shouldn't be touched? But the thought of keeping the bag a secret gnawed at him. He couldn't just leave it here, not after he had gone to all the trouble of digging it up. He took a deep breath, telling himself that it was better to know than to keep wondering. Max carefully opened the bag. Inside, there were bundles of money, tied together with rubber bands. He stared at the money in shock. Why would police officers have money like this? His mind raced. But one thing was clear. This wasn't something that should have been in the woods. Max closed the bag quickly, as if to hide the evidence, but it was too late. He now knew too much. He had stumbled onto something big, something he didn't fully understand. His thoughts raced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the officers would come back. What if they found out he had been there? What would he do then? Max knew he needed help, but who could he trust with something like this? Max stood in the middle of the woods, holding the heavy bag in his hands. His heart was pounding as he thought about what to do next. The money inside the bag didn't seem like something that belonged in the peaceful forest where children played and families picnicked. It didn't make sense. Why would police officers bury a bag full of money out here? Was it a mistake, or something much worse? Max's mind raced as he tried to understand the situation. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the bag. He was nervous, not knowing what to do with the money. His first instinct was to take it home and tell his parents, but then he thought about the officers. What if they came back looking for the bag? What if they knew he had found it? He quickly realized that it wasn't safe to keep it with him. After a few minutes, Max made a decision. He couldn't leave the bag there. It was too important. But he also knew he needed to be careful. He didn't want to get caught. Max quickly buried the bag back in the hole he had dug earlier. He covered it with dirt as best as he could, trying to make it look like nothing had been disturbed. His hands were shaking, but he did his best to stay calm. Once the bag was hidden, he stepped back and looked at the spot. The forest looked the same as it had before, but Max knew something dangerous had just happened in this quiet place. Max knew he couldn't leave things like this. The officers had acted too strangely, and he had seen too much. But what could he do? He was just a boy. Who would believe him if he told anyone? Who would even listen to him? His head was full of questions, and he didn't have the answers. Max thought about going home and telling his parents, but he quickly shook that idea off. His parents wouldn't understand. They would probably just tell him to forget about it and never think about the bag again. But Max couldn't forget. He felt like he was part of something much bigger than just a simple secret. He knew that whatever was in that bag was important, important enough that the police officers didn't want anyone to know about it. So Max did what he always did when he needed help. He thought about his neighbor, Mr. Thompson, an older man who had been a police officer in the past. Max liked Mr. Thompson because he always listened and didn't treat him like just a kid. Maybe Mr. Thompson would know what to do. Maybe he would help him figure out what had really happened in the woods. Max made up his mind. He would go to Mr. Thompson's house. He would tell him everything. Mr. Thompson might be able to help him, even if the situation was dangerous. With that decision in mind, Max stood up, wiped the dirt from his hands, and turned toward the edge of the woods. His heart was still racing, but he knew he had to do something. He couldn't keep this secret forever. Max walked quickly through the woods, his mind buzzing with thoughts about the bag, the officers, and what had just happened. He had never seen anything like this before. What was he supposed to do with this secret? The weight of it pressed down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had uncovered something dangerous, something that could change everything. Max's steps grew faster as he approached Mr. Thompson's house. He lived just on the edge of the woods, in a little house with a white picket fence. It looked like any other house, but Max knew there was more to Mr. Thompson than just his quiet, kind nature. He had been a police officer for many years before he retired, and Max always felt like he could trust him with anything. Max knocked on the door. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, but he took a deep breath and waited. A few moments later, the door opened, and there stood Mr. Thompson, his kind face appearing from behind his glasses. "Well, hello there, Max. What brings you here today?" Mr. Thompson asked with a warm smile. Max hesitated for a second, trying to find the right words. "Mr. Thompson, I saw something. Something strange in the woods," he said, his voice low and serious. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Strange? What kind of strange?" Max took a deep breath and began to explain what had happened. He told Mr. Thompson about the two officers, the bag, and how they had buried it in the woods. He described everything he had seen. The officers' nervous glances, the way they acted like they were hiding something, and the bag full of money. As he spoke, Mr. Thompson's face grew serious. He didn't interrupt Max, but his eyes showed he was paying close attention. When Max finished, Mr. Thompson stood silently for a moment, thinking. He looked at Max, then at the woods in the distance. "Max, this is very serious. What you saw today is not something we can ignore," he said quietly. Max felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief because Mr. Thompson believed him, but fear because he didn't know what would happen next. "What should I do, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Mr. Thompson sighed. "You did the right thing by coming to me, but what you're dealing with is bigger than you and me. I think we need to go back to that spot and see if the bag is still there. If it is, we need to figure out exactly what's going on." Max's eyes widened. "You mean, go back to the woods? But what if those officers come back?" Mr. Thompson smiled softly. "We'll be careful. I'll make sure we stay out of sight. But we have to know what's really going on before you get in any more trouble." Max hesitated. He had never imagined his day would turn out like this. But he trusted Mr. Thompson. If anyone could help him figure out what was in the bag and what the officers were hiding, it was Mr. Thompson. "I'm ready," Max said, his voice firm. He had already made up his mind. He couldn't let this secret stay buried. The truth had to come out. Max and Mr. Thompson made their way through the woods, moving carefully so they wouldn't make any noise. The trees around them were thick, and the shadows were long as the sun began to set. Max's heart was beating fast. He was excited, but also scared. What if the officers had already come back? What if they saw them? He couldn't help but feel nervous, but he kept following Mr. Thompson, knowing that this was the right thing to do. They reached the spot where Max had dug up the bag earlier. Max pointed to the ground, showing Mr. Thompson where the officers had buried it. The area still looked undisturbed, just as it had when Max had left it. The dirt around the spot was soft, but there was no sign that anyone had been there since Max had buried the bag back. Mr. Thompson knelt down and gently brushed his fingers over the dirt. He looked up at Max with a serious expression. "You've done a good job covering it up," he said quietly. "Now we need to see if the bag is still here." Max watched as Mr. Thompson carefully began to dig. He moved slowly, his hands working with precision. Max's stomach twisted with a mix of fear and curiosity. What if they found something dangerous? What if it wasn't just money, but something worse? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just a bag of cash. After a few minutes of digging, Mr. Thompson's hand hit something hard. Max's heart jumped in his chest. There it was, the bag. It was just where Max had left it. Mr. Thompson looked at him and nodded. It's still here. Let's see what's inside. Mr. Thompson carefully pulled the bag out of the hole and placed it on the ground. Max could feel his palms getting sweaty as he looked at the bag. His mind raced. What was going to happen next? Would they find something that would explain why the officers had buried it here? With a steady hand, Mr. Thompson untied the bag. He opened it slowly, careful not to make any noise. As the bag opened, Max could see stacks of money, tightly wrapped in rubber bands. His eyes widened in surprise. The bag was full of cash, just like he had seen earlier. But what made Max's heart race even faster was the sight of a stack of official-looking documents tucked underneath the money. They were papers, like something you would find in a government office. Mr. Thompson's face grew darker as he looked at the contents of the bag. "This isn't just money," he said softly. "These papers could be important. And the money. This is not something normal police officers would be involved in." Max couldn't speak. He had no idea what this all meant, but he knew that whatever was in that bag wasn't something that should be hidden in the woods. "What do we do now?" Max finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to make sure this gets into the right hands," Mr. Thompson said. "But we also need to be careful. This is a lot bigger than we thought." Max nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. He had seen enough to know that they had uncovered something dangerous. But now he had no choice but to help Mr. Thompson figure out what to do with it all. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. Max and Mr. Thompson sat on a fallen log, the bag of money and documents between them. The woods were silent around them, the only sound being the occasional rustling of leaves. Max felt a knot in his stomach as he stared at the contents of the bag. The sight of the money made him feel uneasy, but the papers were what truly worried him. They didn't look like regular documents. They looked important, too important to be buried in the woods. Mr. Thompson carefully examined the papers, his brow furrowed. He didn't say anything at first, just flipping through the pages, reading a few sentences here and there. Max could tell that the older man was deep in thought, trying to make sense of what they had found. "What do you think?" Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson looked up at him, his face serious. "These papers are strange. They look like they're from a government office, but they don't make sense. Some of these signatures are forged, and the names don't match up. It's like someone was trying to hide something. And the money. It's too much to be from a simple mistake." Max felt his stomach tighten. He had a feeling that they were dealing with something much bigger than he could understand. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "It means that we're looking at something serious. This isn't just a random act by a couple of bad cops. This is organized, and it's bigger than we thought," Mr. Thompson replied, his eyes scanning the papers again. Max was quiet for a moment, thinking about what Mr. Thompson had said. "So, what do we do now? What happens next?" Mr. Thompson sighed and stood up. "We need to get these papers to the right people. If we try to go to the police now, they might cover it up. We can't trust everyone. But we can't just leave it here either. This needs to be handled carefully." Max nodded, feeling a weight on his shoulders. He had no idea how to fix this, but he trusted Mr. Thompson. The older man had always seemed wise, and Max knew that if anyone could figure this out, it was him. "We'll take the papers to someone who can help us," Mr. Thompson continued. "But we have to be careful. If anyone finds out that we're looking into this, it could be dangerous." Max's mind raced. He thought about what might happen if the wrong people found out they had the papers. Would the officers come looking for them? Would they get in trouble for what they had uncovered? Max didn't know, but he knew one thing. They couldn't just ignore it. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath and looked at Max. You did the right thing by coming to me, Max. But this is just the beginning. We'll have to be smart about this. We can't let anyone know what we found. Max stood up, determination settling in his chest. He didn't know exactly what they were going to do next, but he knew that the secret they had uncovered couldn't stay buried. The truth had to come out, no matter how dangerous it was. Let's get it to the right people, Max said, his voice filled with resolve. We can't just let it go. Mr. Thompson smiled faintly. You've got a brave heart, Max. We'll do this together. With that, the two of them carefully packed the papers back into the bag and started heading toward town. The quiet woods around them no longer felt peaceful. They were leaving behind a secret, but they were also stepping into something much bigger than they could ever have imagined. Max and Mr. Thompson walked briskly through the woods, the weight of the bag of money and documents hanging between them. It felt as though the forest had closed in around them, each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making Max jump. He was nervous, but he also felt a sense of urgency. They had to get to town and find someone who could help them before things got out of hand. They reached the edge of the woods, and Max took a deep breath. The familiar path that led to the town seemed peaceful, but his mind was filled with worries. What would happen if the officers realized the bag was missing? What if someone came after them to get it back? The thought made him feel even more uneasy. Mr. Thompson glanced at Max and saw the concern in his eyes. We need to get these documents to someone who can take care of this, he said. But we'll have to be careful. We don't want to tip off anyone who might be involved in whatever's going on. Max nodded. He had never been this involved in something so serious before. It felt like their every move was being watched, even though no one was around. The quiet town, once so familiar and safe, now seemed full of hidden dangers. As they made their way to the small police station in town, Max couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. What if they uncovered something that no one was ready to hear? What if this was bigger than just the officers? His thoughts raced as they approached the station. Mr. Thompson paused for a moment outside the building, looking around to make sure they weren't being followed. He then led Max inside, where the quiet atmosphere felt almost out of place. The station was small, with only a few desks and a handful of officers. It was nearly empty, and Max wondered if it was the right place to go. I know someone here who can help, Mr. Thompson said, his voice steady. He walked toward the desk of a middle-aged officer who looked up when he entered. Officer Harris, I need to talk to you in private. It's about something serious. Officer Harris looked at Mr. Thompson with a raised eyebrow, but nodded. What's going on? He asked, lowering his voice. Mr. Thompson explained the situation in as few words as possible. He mentioned the bag, the money, and the strange documents, without going into too many details. Officer Harris listened carefully, his expression turning serious as he heard what Mr. Thompson had to say. I'll make some calls, Officer Harris said after a long pause. But you're right. This is bigger than what we can handle alone. I'll bring in the right people to take a look at everything. Max felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had done the right thing. The papers and money were now in the hands of someone who could be trusted. He looked up at Mr. Thompson, his nerves starting to settle. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, Max said quietly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped me. Mr. Thompson smiled and placed a hand on Max's shoulder. You did the right thing, Max. You didn't ignore what you saw. That takes courage. Max felt proud, but also worried about what would happen next. He had seen just a small part of something much bigger, and now there were people who would investigate it further. Max didn't know where this story would go, but he knew that one thing was for sure. The truth was finally out. Max could hardly sleep that night. His mind kept racing, replaying the events of the day over and over. The woods, the officers, the bag, they all felt like parts of a story he couldn't fully understand. But now that the truth was out, he couldn't stop thinking about what would happen next. The following morning, Max woke up early, his stomach in knots. He had decided to go back to the woods to see if anything had changed. He didn't know why. Maybe he was hoping that everything had been a mistake, that nothing would come of it. But deep down, he knew that what they had uncovered was something big. He grabbed his backpack, hoping to find some sort of clue or answer. His parents were still asleep, so he quietly slipped out of the house and headed toward the woods. As he walked through the trees, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The woods, which had once seemed so peaceful and familiar, now felt full of hidden dangers. The air was thick with tension, and Max's footsteps felt louder than usual. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. When he arrived at the spot where the bag had been buried, he paused. The area looked exactly the same. Nothing had been disturbed. He knelt down and touched the ground, still feeling the faint outline of the hole where he had dug. Everything seemed so normal, yet Max knew that it wasn't. Just as he was about to leave, he heard a voice behind him. "Max, what are you doing here?" Max spun around, startled to see Mr. Thompson standing at the edge of the clearing. The older man had a serious look on his face, but there was a warmth in his eyes. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I thought I'd come check on the spot," Max said, trying to sound casual. "I just couldn't stop thinking about it." Mr. Thompson nodded, understanding. "It's a good idea to keep an eye on things. But we need to be careful. The investigation has already begun." Max felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He wanted to know what was happening, but he also felt nervous about what they would find. "Has anyone found out anything yet?" he asked. Mr. Thompson looked around the clearing, making sure no one else was nearby. "We're in touch with the right people now. The money, the documents, they've been sent to experts. It's too soon to say what exactly we're dealing with, but it's clear that it's not something that should have been hidden." Max felt a small sense of hope. At least things were moving forward, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to this story. Just as Max was about to ask more questions, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket, surprised to see a message from Officer Harris. The message was short but clear. "We found something. Come to the station as soon as you can." Max's heart raced. What had they found? Were the officers involved in something even bigger? He looked at Mr. Thompson, who nodded. "We need to go to the station now," Mr. Thompson said. "It sounds like we're getting closer to the truth." Max and Mr. Thompson headed back to town, their pace quickening. The quiet town, once so familiar and safe, now felt like the center of something that could change everything. Max and Mr. Thompson arrived at the police station, their hearts heavy with the weight of everything they had discovered. The air was thick with tension as they walked through the door, both feeling the magnitude of what they were about to face. Max's hands were shaking, but he knew they were on the verge of finding something that could change everything. Inside the station, Officer Harris was waiting for them. His expression was serious, and he didn't waste any time. "We've gone through the documents," he said, his voice low. "And I'm afraid you were right, Mr. Thompson. The officers involved in this are part of something much bigger than we realized." Max's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've traced the money and the documents," Officer Harris explained. "It looks like these officers were part of a larger criminal operation. They've been involved in illegal activities for months, maybe even longer. The money you found, it's not just stolen. It's linked to a series of crimes we've been investigating for a while." Max felt his stomach tighten. He had always trusted the police, but now everything felt different. The people he had once looked up to were involved in something dark and dangerous. Mr. Thompson placed a hand on Max's shoulder. "This is why we have to be careful. These are not just rogue officers. This goes deeper than we ever thought." Officer Harris nodded in agreement. "The truth is, we've had our suspicions about some officers in the department for a while. But we didn't have the evidence to prove it. Now we do. Max could hardly believe it. Everything that had seemed so normal, the officers, the town, was now tainted by corruption. He had uncovered something that no one could have imagined. But at the same time, he felt proud. He had played a part in bringing the truth to light, no matter how difficult it was to accept. The good news, Officer Harris continued, is that we've already started moving forward. The officers who buried the bag have been placed under investigation. We're going to bring them in for questioning, and this whole operation is going to be exposed. We couldn't have done it without your help, Max. Max felt a mix of relief and confusion. He had never thought he'd be involved in something like this, but he knew, deep down, that he had done the right thing. He had followed his instincts, and it had led him to the truth. Mr. Thompson smiled at him. You did something a lot of adults wouldn't have the courage to do. You saw something wrong and didn't ignore it. That's something to be proud of. Max looked at the bag of money and the documents, still sitting on the table. It felt strange to be sitting in a police station with evidence of corruption right in front of him. But he knew that with this new information, they had the power to make a difference. I didn't do it alone, Max said quietly. Mr. Thompson helped me. Officer Harris smiled. You both did the right thing. And now, thanks to you, we can make sure this never happens again. As Max left the station later that day, he felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The truth had come out, and justice was on its way. He had helped unmask a corruption that had been hidden for far too long. The woods that had once seemed so peaceful now held a different meaning for Max. They were a reminder of the day he stood up for what was right. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, Max knew he had made a difference.